Hi everyone, my name is Valentina Cattane and I am the Training Quality Coordinator of the ORA program. In this video, I would like to shortly talk about course design. There are many approaches to course design, and regardless of the theory, I would like to share in this video how I approach course design and how you could, as a professor and not necessarily an instructional designer, approach course design for your own course and independently. First of all, I adopt a backward design. So I start from the end. That is why this approach is called backward design. So I start by asking myself what I would like my students to know at the end of the course. And then based on that, I try to design my learning activities and my assessment practices, having in mind my pedagogical approach and learning theories that I would like to implement through my instructional practices. As I said, we're not all instructional designers, so we don't need to know all the theory behind instructional design and course design. There can be some sources that are actually freely available online that can be useful to design your own course. And one of them is a self-directed guide to designing courses for significant learning, which you find freely available online. It's really a guide, a self-directed guide that guides you through each step of a course design process. So you could potentially design your course with this support without the need of an instructional designer. Because what's very important is that we think about the main aspects that sometimes are not aligned in our course. So what I would like you to think about is, if you think about your course, what would you find essential in your course? What I find essential in a course are these three main aspects. Not just them, but I mean, these three are the main ones. So the learning goals, which I actually define as learning outcomes. And of course, you will need to follow the system of your university and the definition of your university of learning outcomes and objectives. In general, what's important and we can all agree upon is that with learning outcomes, we try to express in a measurable way what we want our students to know at the end of the course. And this has to be measurable because there should also be assessment. So if I want my students to know something specific, how do I make sure, first of all, that I support my students in the achievement of that outcome? And then how can I have evidence that the outcome has been achieved? How can I measure it to clarify whether it has been achieved or not? And what can the students do to make sure that with feedback provided by me, they can eventually achieve the outcome? So what we could agree upon, regardless of the specific terminology used by your institution, is that with the learning outcomes, we want to define what we want our students to know at the end of the course, and that should be measurable, and how their behavior will change at the end of the course. So not just their skills and their abilities, but also their behavior. So what this guide can be useful for is to remind us that we need to align these main elements in our course. I will give you an example. One recurrent outcome in courses could be, I want my students to learn how to critically think. So I would like to reflect with you on which activity would you design to achieve this outcome, and how would you assess it? So for instance, if we have in a course this outcome and I want my students to think critically, and my learning activity, my main learning activity is lecture, am I asking my students to think critically and to practice this skill or not? If not, what could I change? How could this activity support the achievement of this outcome and help my students practice critical thinking? One other problem is the assessment. So if I, at the end of my course, of my day, I need to design my assessment practice, and I decide to design an exam to use as a assessment tool, an exam, and I do not insert any thinking questions, but I just make sure that they understand the content, they identify the main aspects of the course content delivered. Am I assessing the achievement of my learning outcome, which is, once again, that my students need to learn and practice critical thinking? So if I have an outcome at the beginning of my course which I do not assess or I do not support through learning activities, I'm not aligning these elements and I'm not supporting students in the actual achievement of the outcomes that I was planning at the beginning of the course. That is why this self-directed guide has also 5 steps of design, which are not prescriptive in reality. I wouldn't want anyone to stick only to these 5 steps. What these steps are for is to encourage professor to reflect on some of the aspects of course designing while planning their own course. And that is why we have prompt questions for each step. So at the beginning of the course, do we take into consideration situational factors? So do we take into consideration the context we work in and we're dealing with, for instance, our pre-knowledge of the context that we work in, for instance, in GMA University, or the students that we had the previous year. But are we also gathering data about the new students that we don't really know and that could inform our instruction and change the course design? So all these situational factors are very useful at the beginning of the course design, but also throughout the entire course, because they can change and inform the instruction and change the design of our course that should be flexible. So it should change during the delivery based on the formative feedback that we get from students, based on the students we're dealing with and their needs and their specific learning needs and preferences. Do we think about the learning goals? So what do we want students to learn by the end of the course? And then, as I said, think of learning activities that could help them achieving the outcome, and how do we measure the achievement of that outcome through assessment practices that are not just summative but also formative throughout the course. So all these elements should be aligned, and sometimes having handouts like this and starting from a small unit can actually help reflecting on all these aspects that are sometimes quite complex. So if we think of a small activity, a very small activity that you currently have in a face-to-face setting, so why do you have that activity? What would you like your students to get out of that activity? What would you like them to understand or to know better at the end of that activity. That is your learning outcome. So try to define what you want to achieve and your learning activity. And the assessment, so how do I measure that they actually achieve the outcome? How do I provide formative feedback throughout the activity? How do I grade them? So all these elements in relation to a small activity can be quite useful to reflect on. And if we want to think about a technology component, then we will talk about that in a different video. But once we thought about the design of an activity, I would like you to start reflecting on how could technology enhance this activity? Is it needed? Is it not very useful in my specific activity? Can my students achieve this learning outcome without the need of a technology component? So could the technology be useful in the learning process? Could be essential or not? And then we will think about technology and reflect on technology in a different course, in a different video. What's essential while designing a course is that we think about these main components. There are learning outcomes, learning activities, and the learning theories that underpin them, and the assessment practices. And the alignment of all the three main aspects. As designing a course is quite time-consuming and quite difficult, what's sometimes useful is to start from a small activity to then move progressively to the entire course. So to start from a smaller unit to think about these aspects, and then think about the bigger picture and the outcomes, for instance, of the entire course, and how all the activities design can support the achievement of the main course outcomes. So I would like you to know what you think about that, and how do you design your course? What do you think about when you design your course? Do you define your learning outcomes based only on your teacher's perspectives? Or you make sure also to reflect on your students' perspective? So when I design a course, I am very optimistic and I hope I can achieve 20 different outcomes. Is that realistic? Shall I also reflect on what my students can actually achieve in a limited time and with limited support? Should I then redefine my objectives based on my students' perspective and the data I collected during the pre-assessment phase? So there are all elements that need some reflection while designing a course. And I do hope that this worksheet can help you in guiding your reflection and trying to visually see whether these main elements are aligned or not in your activity as well as in your course.